Professor, physician, epidemiologist. I am Dr. Sri Banerjee. And a concerned physician. In this presentation, I will be showing you how the chemical structures translate from some cultural context in order to provide further meaning and understanding of some everyday things. So now transitioning on, we should be talking now a little bit more about the chemical compounds itself. And so one that comes to mind when we're thinking about the aroma, the scent that really help us in immune boosting, in improving in inflammation, and in improving in concentration, things like that. When we're thinking about these things, another one that comes to mind is benzene rings. And of course, I had mentioned previously about the story of exploring benzene rings in the organic chemistry lab 20 years ago when I first set foot, wanted to discover how to create vanilla, the scent within the lab. And to my surprise, I was able to actually, from a couple of hours, just be able to combine multiple compounds and provide a really good um, uh, aromatic uh, hydrocarbon. So this is where my interest came from, and so benzene rings are really can really be wacky because of the fact that um, it's stable. It's more stable than usual compounds, and the question is why. And I'm going to show you within this visual what's going on a little bit, but if you're thinking about B naught here, so if you're thinking about how the magnetic force is, so let's back up here. Usually when you're thinking about benzene rings, we're thinking about a hexagonal compound, and traditionally every other carbon has a double bond. So even though there are 6 carbons, only between three of them have double bonds, and so it's an alternate. It's shown as an alternate, every alternate bond. But the fact of the matter is that when you're doing tests, you're seeing that there's a much higher stability than if this were to have just alternate bonds. So the better way to think about this is that similar to other aromatic structures, so benzene is considered an aromatic structure because we perceive these as having aroma. And so the sextet of p electrons, what do I mean by the sextet? So the 6 electrons which are in the p orbital. Now, when I'm talking about the p orbital, I'm talking about the p orbital that the electron cloud has a probability of existing in at any given moment. So this is going into some quantum mechanics and the understanding that deviating from classical mechanics, at no given point can we accurately estimate where an electron is. So we have to, the best we can do is have an estimate that shows where it is. So in the p orbital, we can show that. And so here, additionally, we can map out what the shielding and deshielding is going on, and so how much magnetic force. So anything on this side is adding to the magnetic force, and anything in the middle is actually subtracting from the magnetic force. So if you think about what is going on in the center as the benzene ring, and the blue as the electrons, so anything that is on this side is successful in shielding, and then anything on this side is de-shielding. And so what is interesting is how much positivity or negativity and how much stability is coming up. So because of this, you have a chemical shift of 7.3 parts per million for its hydrogen atoms. And so there's actually more stability. So if you think about the benzene ring, one of the more interesting aspects of this is how this first came about. So the person that this is attributed to is Auguste Kekule. And of course, there's the alternating double and single bonds in a benzene ring. So the pi bonds, what it is considered the sp2 hybridized bonds actually create bonds between them, and those are called pi bonds. And so that provides additional stability, and so there's delocalized electrons. So at no given point, like I told you, you have to think about this from a quantum perspective where electrons have a cloud. And so you can think about it as it's not explained with one unique structure. It has to be a resonance, hybrid, or the one-all theory. So if you think about the story, what happened was Kekule's testimony incriminated a servant who had been stealing from a countess. So this was when Kekule was only 20, and so he was called to testify, and there was actually a servant that was being incriminated. And initially it was thought, so Countess Gorlitz, when she passed away, initially it was thought that she passed away from spontaneous combustion. But it was Kekule who actually identified this one distinctive ring, and this turned up in the servant's possession. So what happened eventually, Kekule's testimony convicted the right person, but that ring was at the heart of that testimony. And more importantly, that particular ring was no ordinary ring. This ring actually had a snake, a serpent biting, two serpents biting each other's tail, and they were intertwined, and so that symbol stuck in Kekule's mind. So when he was conceiving the benzene ring and trying to think about it, he thought about that old alchemy seal of the two intertwined serpents to be depicting how these electrons behave, because you have to be understanding when Kekule was thinking about these quantum mechanics and quantum ideology even was not there yet. This was in its infancy, so there had to be alternative ways to be thinking. So alchemy was actually one area that provided the solution that was needed. So thinking about the symbol of the Ouroboros, this is actually from about roughly 3000 BC, and this shows, again, one is all, and by it all, and for it all. And if it does not contain all, then all is nothing. Solve et coagula. That's another important term. Namely, what does that mean? Separate and recombine. So a lot of these symbols, and even within the 13 colonies, when preparing for the Revolutionary War, there were some symbols with snakes. A lot of these powerful symbols have its origins in the idea of alchemy and understanding the world in terms of basic opposites, but more importantly, how these combine, how opposites combine in a sort of hieros gamos, or a sort of divine wedding, a chemical wedding, if it's talking about alchemy, a unio mystico, a union of polar pairs. And this is also can be symbolized in the union of Mars and also with Venus. And so this is exemplification of that hieros gamos, or the divine marriage. Another important concept that Jung starts talking about is the process of conjunction, or the conjunctio. And this, I will be going, this motif, this archetypal character, which is in some ways connected to the collective unconscious, is important to this idea of how the Benzene ring came about, and Kekule's conception. So just going back to how Kekule conceived of this, so even though this incident had happened way before he was even thinking about the Benzene ring, when he was actually thinking, the story is that he temporarily fell asleep, and when he woke up, he was dreaming about this, and so this is where he got this idea. So going back to now understanding the Ouroboros, the conjunctio, specifically, Carl Jung wrote this important work known as the Mysterium Conjunctionis, an inquiry into the separation and synthesis of psyche, opposites, and alchemy. And so this was an a priori image, a preconceived image of man's mental development, of human development. And this is something that was popularized by Newman. But again, this included the collective unconscious, the chemical wedding. Also, C is the carrier of the individual wave. So it's actually that the collective is creating more of the individual, and there's discourse in order to fine-tune some of that. But what was intriguing to alchemists and Jungian psychologists alike was the fact that there was an important ability to make compatible things that were opposites. The apparent incompatible elements, the ability to work together of these opposites, this is what was fascinating to alchemists, and symbolized by the Oroboros. So if you're thinking about incompatible elements coexisting in one another, because the dominant factor temporarily represses the opposite one, and vice versa, then this sort of ebb and flow allows for the complete manifestation of the Ouroboros. And so because of this temporary repression, and in the second moment, another repression, kind of this, again, this ebb and flow, allows for the operation of the Ouroboros. And then this is how the Benzene ring and the Kekule structure works with the 6 carbons. So understanding some of this philosophical context really brings to life what this means. So again, about 7 or 8 years ago, on a trip to Athens to the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. They have actually the largest archaeological collection in Greece, and there's a lot of museums, but not as well equipped as that as the one in Greece with art. And even though it was founded in the 19th century, there's still a lot of many different types of collections. So these are three that resemble the Ouroboros. The ones on the um, left and the very right actually represent a double-headed snake, which is kind of without an end, without a beginning. Also have the same idea, but not exactly the same as the precise meaning of the Ouroboros, which is um, what is more resembling in the middle. Um, and even though it doesn't necessarily explicitly show all the different components, the circle does resemble more of an Ouroboros here. So these are all three from my personal collection. So please take a moment to appreciate these. So just looking at the effect of how um, certain benzene rings manifest. And so again, depending on which side, the flavors and the scents are actually different. And you can see how this is the benzene ring and how that plays out. So if you think about the way the interactions happen, this is the electrostatic map and the heat map. So a lot of the electrons stay in the center, but then as we move out, the electrons don't stay as as long. And so the likelihood of electron densities goes lower and lower as you move further out. Again, it's important to remember that these are sp2 hybridized electron orbitals, and so the p orbital is perpendicular ones, and so that's considered the pi orbitals, and this brings a lot of stability to these bonds. And so when you're thinking about some of the scents and the aromatics that are created for aromatherapy or for spices, these are what are predominantly responsible, other than the terpenes, for all of your scents. Sometimes it's good to take a step back, but you can see now that this Ouroboros is responsible for the symbolic understanding and the literal understanding of how, even in quantum mechanics, how some of these things work. Some of the ideas have been transmitted through a lot of our traditional history. So just in a nutshell, in summary, spices and scents for festive seasons are having their origin in benzene rings and aromatic hydrocarbons like terpenes. Now you know that, and these have extremely important not only properties for plants, but medicinal properties, antimicrobial and anti-fungal properties. Some of these same signals that are used to prevent bacterial formation or fungal formation within plants can also be used for humans, and are being used. For instance, Taxol is a well-known um, terpene derivative, which is used to combat cancer. Additionally, perception of structure is really important. So as you were seeing, a lot of those enantiomers, they're mirror images of each other. They don't actually have a different chemical structure whatsoever. So if you were to write the number of carbons and number of hydrogens and oxygens that each one of those have, then you would see that there's no difference. The only way you would be able to tell is if you were to draw. And so understanding the visual of this requires metacognition, and that brings me to my final point, that it is really important to take a step back. Sometimes if you need to do a deeper dive into some historical context or some cultural context which you feel is relevant to understanding science, then you may need to go into some understanding of stories, like we did in the development of understanding the historical transmission of the idea of the Ouroboros. And so just understanding how that connects to the Kekule structure and the aromatic hydrocarbons, the benzene ring, was really important to understanding just the basic effect on how we differentially perceive these. And so I hope this has been very useful in understanding some of those things. Thank you for listening.